Welcome to Association Chat, an online discussion where we warm ourselves by the virtual fire with topics of the day, welcoming thought leaders and trailblazers alike to meet up in this online home for the community. I'm the host of Association Chat, Kiki L'Italien, and I am going to tell you that every year I try to schedule the most important episode of that year for my birthday. My birthday's tomorrow, and this is likely the most important episode that I'll ever record ever for Association Chat. A UN global climate poll in January 2021 revealed that 2/3 of people worldwide think climate change is a global emergency. It stated the voice of the people is clear. They want action on climate change. And then in August of this year, a code red for humanity was issued when the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change report shared that human-induced climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe. Many of us have been experiencing this ourselves. We've been in the midst of freak tornadoes or odd flooding. This happened close to home for me as well. So what does this have to do with us? You know, in many interviews that I and my colleagues at Tecker International have been conducting for various associations, member leaders are asking for their associations to put a stake in the ground. And they're talking about putting a stake in the ground on issues that they care about. What issues do they mention? Well, a lot of times they mention DEI, and they talk about climate change. Now, I'm going to give you one more fact before I introduce you to our guests. In the American Society of Association Executives report, The Power of Associations, an objective snapshot of the U.S. association community, stated that the IRS recognized 66,985 trade and professional associations with membership organizations employing more than 1.3 million people. Now, that's a lot of influence in the world. If it's too late, as some of the reports suggest, for sustainability and regeneration of our economic, social, and environmental systems, then what is our goal now? Today, we are talking with Dr. Rupert Read, an associate professor of philosophy, campaigner for the Green Party of England and Wales, former spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion, and co-founder of the Green Activists Network. He's the author of various books, including Parents for a Future, How Loving Our Children Can Prevent Climate Collapse. I also have this book right here, which is called Deep Adaptation. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. And then also Shelly Alcorn, who is principal in Alcorn Associates Management Consulting. She's a frequent keynote speaker to associations, focusing on critical issues faced by organizations and society at large. And now she is laser focused on our global climate emergency and the role associations need to play in the face of the sixth mass extinction. Boy, I'm really struggling today, but you know what? Here we are. Thank you, Rupert and Shelly, for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
All right. Climate change is on everyone's minds. You know, you see it when you turn on the TV. And recently, of course, we heard a little bit about something called COP26. Now, Dr. Read, you recently returned from an important convention, COP26, that took place with some dismal but not entirely unexpected news about where things stand with the progress that's being made by our planet's governmental leaders on this issue of catastrophic climate change. Could you share with us what COP26 is, and then why it is that association leaders need to know about it, and what they need to understand about what happened there this year?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was in Glasgow the whole time at COP26. COP stands for Conference of the Parties. It basically means all the world's governments getting together and trying to agree what to do about this quintessential global issue, dangerous man-made climate damage. And well, what happened at Glasgow, the very short version is not a lot, really. I'd been warning for a long time that we were likely to get a pretty poor outcome at COP26. I must tell you that even I was disappointed by how little was achieved, as was the president of COP26, Alok Sharma, who on the final day basically broke down into tears on stage and sort of held the tears back as men are supposed to do, right? And because he was so disappointed with how little progress they had made. I mean, they came up with this and that. They came up with an agreement on limiting methane emissions, which is important, very important. They came up with some kind of language which they hadn't used before, but there was so little concrete progress in terms of anything that committed anybody to anything that will actually stop the seemingly inexorable rise of climate dangerous gases and their levels in our atmosphere. And so what does this mean? Well, what this means is that we're in terrible trouble. I mean, we're in such bad trouble, and it's almost certainly, unless you've been really looking into this, it's almost certainly a lot worse than you think. This is a slow burn issue. It's not like the coronavirus. So human beings are typically not very good at dealing with slow burn issues. Each year it gets a bit worse, and then a bit worse, and then a bit worse. And make no mistake, it's a burn issue, right? Just look at what's happened in North America over this year. I mean, this so-called heat dome that you had this summer over the entire western half of the continent. This has, I'm going to be very blunt now, this has scared scientists shitless. This wasn't supposed to happen. Nothing like this was supposed to happen for another 40, 50, 60 years. But it happened. What happened? Well, you remember the terrible wildfires and so forth. But the thing which was really extraordinary is these raised ultra high temperatures day after day after day, right up into Canada, you know, not that far short of the Arctic Circle. In British Columbia, temperatures of 49 degrees centigrade. It's halfway to boiling point. This is deeply scary stuff. And then right now, of course, British Columbia's got a double whammy. Right now, British Columbia has been hit by these absolutely unprecedented rains, floods, mudslides. British Columbia is basically pretty much still cut off by surface travel from the rest of Canada as we speak. And this is a rich, developed country. You know, if this is the kind of hit that countries like ours, as it were, are taking, then imagine what it's like for the rest of the world. So COP26 did basically pretty much nothing to stop this slow, steady transition to growing climate chaos, which means weather chaos, to gradual growing overheat of our climate, of our globe. And this places us in a desperate position, especially as I say, I sometimes call this the double emergency. There is a climate emergency, a climate and ecological emergency, but also it's not really recognized as an emergency by governments, by most businesses, by most media, by most people. And that means the emergency is doubled, because if you're in an emergency and you're dealing with it, that's one thing. If you're in an emergency and you're not dealing with it, then it's doubled. It's twice as bad. So situation is really deeply dire, and what people on this call need to be thinking about is that this stuff, this shit, is coming for you. I mean, if you're on this call from British Columbia, it has just come for you really heavily twice this year. Wherever you are, you've probably experienced some of it, and you're going to experience more of it. We in the UK have been relatively lucky in the last few years. That luck is not going to hold. COP26 was supposed to be about a deal to keep global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees, which is frankly not safe, but would not be a lot worse than where we are right now. But there's no way that's going to happen. I mean, 1.5 degrees, that the reality is, if you talk to any climate scientist, they'll tell you it's just not going to happen. We're not on a path towards 1.5 degrees. We're on a path towards somewhere in the 2 degrees range centigrade we're talking here. And probably 2.7, 2.8, 3 degrees. I mean, that is a level of damage which is something like 5 or 6 times as bad as we currently have, because this is a trigonometric, exponential relationship, right? 2 degrees is about 3 times as bad as 1 degree. 3 degrees is about 6 times as bad as 1 degree. So you need to expect the kinds of weather disasters that we've been having this year multiplied during this century by about 6 times or worse. So if you're in British Columbia, if you're somewhere which is really unlucky, in a generation's time, where maybe it'll be like about 3 times as bad as it currently is, in a generation's time, you would be getting the heat dome for maybe 3 times as long, and then you'd be getting kind of 3 lots of these mega floods or something, all in 1 year. I mean, that's entirely possible that will be happening by the time that people who are 30, 40 years old on this call today are retiring. So this is not scaremongering. These are just the facts. This is just reality. It's not very widely understood, partly because it is a slow burn, partly because there have been huge vested interests that have made it their business for a long time now to try to stop us from waking up to this reality. But their power is fading. It's not gone, especially in the USA, but it's fading as the reality gradually forces itself onto our attention. So I'm here to say, for Christ's sake, we need to wake up to this and do something about it. COP26 has not helped us to do anything significant about it. So the burden falls on us, businesses, associations. You're going to have to step up to the plate and start doing some of this for yourselves, and have to press also your governments to do a lot more of it too. Because if you don't, being hit by this kind of stuff when you're not prepared is going to be so much worse than being hit by it if you're prepared.
And I think that as someone who grew up reading, we have these things called weekly readers that we would get, a Scholastic Weekly Reader that I would get in grade school. We'd read these, and the reports about what climate change could mean in the future. I remember reading this in grade school, right?
Yeah.
But there was this question about, is it really is there really going to be change? Is this just natural cyclical stuff that happens on the globe? And here we are, and we're seeing the ramifications of all of this. We know without a doubt that now we're going to be facing these issues. And now there's this question of, okay, now what? Now what do we do? Because we've reached this point. I wanted to ask you about, so there's this book that you're the co-author of, Deep Adaptation. And I know that you talk a lot about transformative adaptation, deep adaptation. What are these things? And what does this have to do with the way that leaders need to prepare?
Yeah. Thank you. Really important question. Let me ease into it by giving you one more little sort of set of anecdotes from scientists, from my experience recently at the COP. So I work at the University of East Anglia, as you said, which is one of the world's leading climate science centres. I work alongside a lot of these folk. And some of you might think that the account I've just given is exaggerated or scaremongering or something like that. It really isn't. It's simply an extrapolation from what's been happening this year, from what's been modelled and spoken about for a long time, and is now unequivocally established. And the anecdote is this, that because I work alongside these people, I don't just read their papers, I get to chat with them, and I get to have a drink with them and stuff like that. And if you talk to climate scientists off the record and say, so, what do you really think? Is it maybe not quite as bad as this latest paper says, or is it worse, or what's the real deal? What they will virtually always tell you, and what climate scientists were saying to me off the record at Glasgow, is, well, it's almost certainly worse than what we've published, because we only publish what we can prove, right? This is something really important for people to understand about scientists. Scientists are naturally conservative beasts. They don't like to risk saying anything that might be wrong. They are very averse to bad publicity. And this has been, and of course, it's all the attacks they've had from climate deniers and so forth has just entrenched this tendency. They've been trying to cover themselves, made the problem worse. And scientific institutions like the IPCC are even more conservative. They're hyper-conservative. They impose another kind of whole set of sort of hurdles that you have to go through before you get anything into print. So what climate scientists say to me when I chat to them over a cup of tea, whatever, is, well, I think it's probably worse than what I've written in print, than what I publish. I'm deeply afraid for my future. I'm deeply afraid for my kids' future, etc. So what does this mean? What it means is that we have to obviously redouble our efforts to do what is called mitigation of the problem, which is to reduce climate dangerous emissions, to steadily reduce the amount of fossil fuels that we use, to also attack other parts of the problem, like overfishing, for example. Overfishing is a very serious problem from a climate perspective, partly because when you take the fish out of the sea, you stop their carbon from being sequestered at the ocean bed. There's much more to talk about how the oceans need protecting and so forth. But as well as mitigation, we are now in the age of consequences, right? We are now in the age of all the stuff that we've seen this year. The catastrophic floods in Germany, the catastrophic floods right now in British Columbia, the terrible heat dome over North America this year, the ring of fire around the Mediterranean this summer. These are just examples from the developed world, let alone the global South, which has coped with often even worse stuff. So we're in the age of consequences. We need to cope with that. We need to proactively plan on how to cope with what's coming and what's here. And we need to build our resilience to it. And that is what is no longer enough. We need to engage in adaptation as well, because the crisis is here and it is going to go on getting worse for a very, very long time to come due to the chronic inaction of our leaders and the criminal absurdities of the deniers. So what does adaptation mean? Well, it means a whole lot of things. Basically, it means trying to build our resilience, trying to reduce our vulnerability, trying to prepare ourselves for the kinds of shocks that we can predict, and to some extent that we can't predict, like the heat dome this summer. We need to build in wherever possible a margin of greater safety, and that involves thinking carefully. It involves thinking long term, and it involves thinking in terms of things that we need to do quite immediately. So let's give a kind of set of examples prompted by the what's happened in British Columbia. We need to future-proof our infrastructure. We need to expect that so-called once in a thousand year storms could now come every 50 years or every 20 years. And we need to expect that there'll be storms which are so huge that nothing in our previous experience has prepared us for them. As, for example, in the unprecedented rainfall that we had in Houston when they had their terrible storm. Remember that a couple of years ago now. Just completely off the scale, off the charts in terms of the amount of water that fell in a 24-hour period. We're not going to be able to do all of this, by the way, through constructing things like hard flood defenses. That might be the first thing you think of when you think of adaptation or resilience building, and it is part of the picture, but it's only one part of the picture. We also have to think much more long-term and in ways that work with nature rather than against nature. So, for example, if you're flood risk, you need to be looking at things like not building in floodplains, obviously, but you also need to be looking at things like, okay, what kind of agriculture do we have in the upland areas? Are we growing food and farming in ways that help us to absorb heavy rainfall into the land? Or are we encouraging, in effect, runoff into streams that then becomes rivers that then sweeps away bridges and roads and cities? And the answer at the moment is often we're doing the latter. Yeah. So a lot of grazing, for example, a lot of grazing from sheep, cows, etc., is basically turning the countryside into a place where rainfall falls and it goes straight off into the watercourses and it races downstream and wrecks everything. So part of what adaptation involves is that kind of joined up thinking to reduce that kind of risk. Another thing it involves is, rather than thinking, well, you know, if all this water is going to be coming down, we need to build higher hard flood defenses, is how can you work with nature rather than against nature as the water comes down as well? So things like restoring wetlands, or in other parts of the world, restoring mangrove swamps in coastal areas, restoring those ways in which nature naturally absorbs floodwater as it comes. And doing that kind of thing that I've just started to describe, that's what's called transformative adaptation. And it's crucial that as we move into this age of consequences, and as we start to take adaptation more seriously, as we absolutely must, it's crucial that we get adaptation right. It's crucial that we don't only do what is called in the literature defensive adaptation or incremental adaptation that tries to, as it were, hold back the waters. No, we need to find ways of allowing the waters to absorb into the land, of allowing the waters to be part of natural processes rather than simply being something we treat as an enemy. So that is an example. There are many, many more, but that is an example of what transformative adaptation is, adapting in such a way that we're changing our society and changing our relationship with the world in the kind of way that we need to do anyway. And if we really take the agenda of transformative adaptation seriously, then we have a far better chance of coming through what's coming. So I want to say to businesses, I want to say to associations, you need to be thinking about this kind of thing for your own business and for those who are in your supply chain. Is my supply chain resilient against the kind of coming weather shocks? And you need to be pressing your government at every level to do much more of this for you, because they are, in 99% of cases, they are way behind the curve. They are way off the pace. It's especially bad, of course, in the States, because you've still got some state governments, for example, who are pathetically pretending that that dangerous human-caused climate change isn't happening or isn't much of a threat. So that's basically the answer on transformative adaptation. Now, what about deep adaptation? What's that? So that's one step even further. And this is going to feel very uncomfortable, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's true. The situation is so bad that we cannot rule out societal collapse. We cannot rule out that our institutions, the ways we have of organizing things at the moment, will fall apart at some time in the next generation or two. And it could be sooner rather than later. Some people think it will happen within the next 10 years, including in societies like the USA or the UK. Deep adaptation is about defending ourselves against that possibility, preparing for that kind of possibility. And I'm not saying that that's the only thing we should do, not at all. As I've just made clear, our main efforts should be in transformative adaptation and in mitigation. But we've got to a point now where we can't avoid thinking about deep adaptation and starting to do some of it. Because if we get, imagine that we got a heat dome like we had last summer, but it lasted for months on end. Or imagine that we get, and this is becoming more possible with each passing year, imagine that we get massive food crises simultaneously in different parts of the world. And scientists and system thinkers are becoming more and more worried about this possibility. We cannot rule out that our societies are not going to be able to take the strain. So deep adaptation is about strengthening our resilience in this way. It's just, it runs right alongside transformative adaptation, but it's also about specifically preparing for the possibility that we will fall apart. And if we prepare for that, we will be better off than if we don't. That is, again, absolutely clear and, you know, just obvious common sense. So adaptation is about a kind of full spectrum response. Yes, we need to do those kinds of hard infrastructure improvements, absolutely, but they need to be within a context of transforming our relationship with each other and with the planet, and that's transformative adaptation. And we also need to give some attention to the really dire or extreme possibilities, because they're the worst ones, and you always need to prepare for the worst ones, and not just say, well, I don't want to face that. No, it's something you don't want to face is something you need to face. So transformative adaptation and deep adaptation as well. And if you start doing some of that, and if you start pressing those who should be thinking about it and doing it to do more of it themselves, well, then over the next few years, you'll get yourselves into a much better position than if you don't.
You mentioned with deep adaptation, looking at some of these situations that could be really dire with this idea of societal collapse, and preparing for our conversation today. I was reading this article by your colleague and co-author of Deep Adaptation, Professor Jim Bendel. And it was a story about the rich people building bunkers in the middle of nowhere, and thinking that Bill Gates is going to get them with the nanobots and stuff, but that the real prepper story is that the militaries are preparing for, like, they're taking it seriously. They're thinking about the fact that there could be this fight for resources due to the breakdown of society because of climate change. And yeah. I think if people collecting their water, and as we had, and I love Pickle, so great tool out there. Starting to think about getting rid of plastic straws isn't enough. Yeah, you might need to take a bigger step. We might need to be thinking about that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. The people like the military are already thinking about this stuff. So the rest of us should be as well. And we need to make sure that the response to these kind of emergent possibilities is not led only by institutions like the military. Because although I have a lot of respect for the military, they're not necessarily the most kind of civically minded, democratically minded. They're not necessarily thinking about what's going to be nice. And, we should think about how we can preserve the possibility of niceness through what's coming. That's really, really important. So, everyone here should be thinking about prepping. But what you've got to understand about prepping is that there's actually very little of it you can do really effectively for yourself or by yourself. To prep effectively, it takes a community, it takes a region, it takes a country, it takes a planet. The broader our perspective is, or at least is compatible with, the better off we're all going to be. So, for example, it's not enough to just think, all right, how do I or my business adapt? You need everyone who's in your constellation to be asking the same question. And ultimately, you don't even know who's in your constellation, right? For example, what you don't want is for people in the next door state, for example, to have things fall apart on them. Because if they do, that's going to rebound on you as well. It'll initially rebound on you in terms of things like you won't have a market there anymore. And then it'll rebound on you in terms of things like people from there will be like desperate and be marauding and whatever. These kind of possibilities cannot be ruled out. Let's put ourselves in a position to minimize them. Let's put ourselves in a position to make this difficult future that tragically we've committed ourselves to as least difficult as possible. So, as I say, it's about how can you adapt and how can you build resilience? It's about how can you pressure others who are within your ambit to do so. Business groups and associations should be thinking about how do we effectively lobby our state government or our federal government, not for tax breaks or whatever, but to do the bloody right thing, to help us to adapt, to help us to prepare, to raise the bar for everybody, to level the playing field up so that bad actors don't get an advantage, right? You need to be thinking about things like lobbying in a completely different way, given the dangerous situation that collectively we're moving into. And as I say, we ought to be thinking about how can we help the rest of the world to adapt and to mitigate better together. That's what the COP was supposed to be doing. But frankly, they mostly aren't doing it and haven't done it. So it needs a step change from us. It needs a step change from us as economic actors, as citizens, as actors in the public sphere.
Yeah, and I want to, Shelly's been quietly listening and absorbing all of this. I know that she's probably just, can't wait to share what she thinks that association executives need to be doing and actually acting on in order to make for greater change, whether it's deep adaptation or transformative adaptation. So Shelly, that's actually my question for you is, so many different association CEOs I know are reaching out and saying, oh, but Shelly, I've got all these concerns about COVID-19 and it impacting our business model. And I've got all of these concerns about my board is really, really, they're bothering me about this thing. What do you have to say about why you think that it's vital for an association executive director to get involved and be focused on this particular topic? Because I know that you take it very seriously.
I do. I take it very seriously. And many of you know, as I've worked with your groups and with the ASAE Next Gen group, I've been talking about climate change and Earth Overshoot Day and other topics along those lines for years, attempting to prepare people for what was likely to come, which is arriving now. And I know many of us in the association space, like Jeff DeCania and myself and you, Kiki, and others, have really attempted to get association professionals to understand the concept of exponential change. What is exponential and what does that actually mean? And it is very different than the linear thinking that associations are famous for. And they're famous for it because structurally, that's the way they're built. They're built for linear thinking. They're built for this is this president's year and this is the vice president. And next year will be the next vice president's year. They have a very staid and steady way of looking at things. And what they need to understand is that as society shifts into an unstable state, associations will shift into an unstable state as well. And they need to prepare for that. We talk a lot in the media about sea level rise. I think because it feels dramatic, Miami, New York, et cetera, in the United States, they don't go one step further to talk about biodiversity loss and what that means for agriculture and food production. It's much easier to talk about the dramatic thing that's on the horizon. It's less fun to talk about the hard things that we need to talk about, which is food shortages, which is loss of access to clean, clear water. It's those things that are emotionally challenging. And it's emotionally challenging for us to realize that right now we're losing 5 million people a year around the globe to climate-related events. Extreme weather stress, extreme heat stress, extreme cold stress. Hi, Texas. You guys had a rough year last year. And 5 million people may not sound like a lot with 7.6 billion people, correct? The exponential function applied to that begins to stagger you a little. It's hard to look at these things because if you do, and you realize that every one of those 5 million souls is a loss, it's something to grieve over. In terms of biodiversity, we've lost 83% of all wild mammals in the last 40 years. We've lost 50% of plant species in the last 40 years. We've seen a 45% decline in insects.
Yeah.
And what that translates to is vulnerabilities, real vulnerabilities. The supply chain issues that you're beginning to experience are not a matter of ships and ports. They're much more related to catastrophe that's coming. And when a hurricane comes through and blows a port to bits, what happens to shipping then? We're not thinking about the hardest things we need to think about. And I believe it was Lenin who said, we're always 3 meals away from a revolution.
Yeah.
Right? And we don't want to get to that point. So this is why we take it seriously. And I do have some suggestions for associations. I can run through them now if you'd like, or we can do it a little later in the broadcast. But associations, I have always believed that you are the strongest engines for social change, and that you have time and time and time again abandoned that responsibility, whether it's social justice, whether it's women's rights, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's, economic justice, whatever it is. I have seen it happen over and over and over.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm asking you to dig deeper. We also failed on sustainability. It's too late for the sustainability conversation. That's over. If you're talking about the fact that your conference is sustainable because you're using water in jugs instead of water in bottles, I have news for you. You are no longer on the cutting edge of where we need to be, which is regeneration. And it was hard enough to get sustainability into the consciousness. So this has to break through our consciousness now. And associations have the capacity, they have the ability. I know you believe you have a mission statement, and I've helped you craft them over decades. But I'm telling you right here, right now, that there's only one mission left. Your mission statement is beautiful, and I think that's great. Our mission is to see how that mission statement, how that purpose, how that industry, how that profession is going to efficiently and correctly adapt and change the way it thinks so that we can preserve as much plant, animal, human, natural life as we possibly can. And that's what I believe you have the ability to do. And that's why I'm here today. I know I'm like the prodigal daughter. I disappeared for 4 years or so. And it's because I was reading book after book after book on climate change and trying to wrap my head around what these actual potentials are. And then trying to figure out how I can articulate that. So I'm glad I'm back, everybody. But I'm coming back to you with a message saying, I know I used to talk about artificial intelligence and that was fun. And I know I used to talk about the future of work and credentialing and that was fun. Now I'm not having fun, but I am doing something that is meaningful. And that is telling you that you have the opportunity, you have the talent, you can do this, but I need you to do it and I need you to do it fast. And not sit there for 1.5 years while a task force looks at the idea of whether or not you should be engaging in the climate fight. There's not that much time left to avoid some of the worst tipping points. We can adapt and we can minimize and we can be intentional and purposeful about it. This is not to be a doomer. This is to be a realist. I have not been radicalized by personalities. I've been radicalized by science. Mm-hmm. And that is the point. And that's why we're here today, to talk about the precautionary principle and to talk about, gosh, if we're left with a better, more regenerated world at the end of it and none of these things come true, well, wouldn't that be a shame? Yeah. Wouldn't that be a terrible outcome to have a better living system for the rest of us, right? So it's the consequences of our actions that we have to take seriously.
And, I have to say, behind the scenes, so Rupert's saying, yeah, absolutely, the biodiversity-based disasters, these food insecurity, these are the issues that, are the real danger. So, Rupert, I thought, if you wouldn't mind speaking to that a little bit, because I do think that people, they look at the ideas about some of the things that you see in the media that are sort of emphasized, but maybe not thinking further down the road, the implications of what we're seeing happen right now.
Mm. Yeah, really, I just wanted to underscore the wonderful things that Shelly is saying there, especially about the difficulty in thinking exponential risk and how poor we often are at that. So there's a lot of talk about sea level rise. Mm-hmm. Sea level rise is more or less in practice a kind of linear phenomenon for the foreseeable future. It's not going to kind of dramatically spike up. So what we need to think is, well, what could dramatically spike up? And the answer is things like extreme weather events and associated food potential shortages, or the kind of problems that we humans never mind the animals themselves, may get as a result of the really dangerous waters we're moving into now in terms of damage to ecosystems. We are in terrible, terrible trouble if pollinators start to get into terrible trouble. And in some parts of the world, that seems to be happening. So yeah, let's try to protect ourselves by protecting against these potentially catastrophic exponential risks. And that's the heart of the work that I've been doing for many years now on what's called the precautionary principle, including with Nassim Taleb, author of The Black Swan. And basically what precautionariness requires of us is to prepare for these kinds of exponential risks, even if we think the risk of them is quite low, because if they happen and we're not prepared for them, it's just so bad. Yeah, that's part of the fundamental spirit that needs to be taken forward here into what you're doing in your business or in your association or in your state, in terms of trying to get us into a position where we're less exposed to these kinds of risks. And yeah, that is just absolutely key. The importance of that cannot be overstated. So look at your supply chain, look at your workforce, look at the constraints that there are upon your product, whatever it is, and think what kinds of seemingly unlikely things might come along to impact this. And we've had an example of this in the past couple of years, is the coronavirus. Nobody saw that coming. Except some of us have been warning for quite a few years, actually, that there was a very real possibility of a pandemic like this, and that more should be being done to prepare for it. And if you go back and look, you can see me saying things like that a few years ago, for example, and you can see other people who are much more specialists saying things about it, including at the highest levels of government. And mostly governments didn't listen. And in terms of the climate situation, the biodiversity situation, COVID is small beer compared to those. It's terrible, but it's just a little taste of the kind of stuff that we could have over the next decade or two.
Rupert, I am so thankful that you joined us today. I know that you have something like another pressing event to go to after this. And so I want to thank you so much for joining us. Shelly, if you can stay on just a little bit to talk a little bit more. But Rupert, when people want to reach out and find out more, how can they reach you? How can they find out more?
Well, you can easily find me on Twitter or at rupertread.net, or a lot of what I'm saying is in my books. So you mentioned Deep Adaptation. There's also Parents for a Future, for example, which is quite a positive read on balance, I hope. It's about how we can, if we really take our role seriously as parents of the future, we can. There is still a possibility of turning this around, and that's what it's really about. Developing the kind of agency we need to turn this around to the maximum extent that we can, and to cope with what's coming. So yeah, I hope that people have found this useful. I'm grateful to you both for this time this afternoon, and good luck, everybody, because you may need a little of it. Yeah, Godspeed.
That's fantastic. What a great gift. Shelly, I know that the work that you've been doing to try to figure out how to apply this to associations specifically, how to take some of the things that Rupert's talking about here with us today, and to make them into these tangible, practical steps that association leaders can actually put into place in their own organizations. So I thought maybe we could talk about that a little bit. And sure. I also wanted to let everyone know that we're talking about releasing a course by text that you'll be able to get some of these steps if you want to learn about them piece by piece down the way. But let's go ahead and talk about some of these steps right now.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'm going to say things no one wants to hear. But that is, I take I think it's Arundhati Roy who said, the trouble is once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
And then you have a moral obligation to speak or not, because every choice you make matters. So I'm here to talk about things that we don't want to hear, but we have to hear them. And we have to start thinking about these things now. The first thing is the obvious thing. Your strategic plan needs an overhaul. Your strategic plan absolutely needs an overhaul from top to bottom. When a conservative body like the United Nations and the IPCC, believe me, that is a politically sanitized report.
Yeah.
And a politically sanitized report has said we need an immediate drawdown of climate-related gases, that some of the climate change that we're experiencing is irreversible.
Yes.
And that our ability to continue as a global species is in danger. You really have to take that in. That's not the UN grandstanding or looking for, right? That is a message coming from the most conservative body on the planet. So your strategic plan needs an overhaul. You need to look at absolutely everything you do in light of, we are in code red for humanity.
Mm-hmm.
We have about a decade to stop the worst ravages that are coming from climate change. What are we doing that either actively contributes to solutions or doesn't? And stop doing all of the stuff that doesn't. It's really that simple. And I posted a link in the chat. You don't have to believe scientists if you don't want to. You don't have to believe the media if you don't want to. However, I believe it's important for you to look at what the United States military is doing. And with little fanfare in October of 2021, the U.S. Office of Director of National Intelligence released Climate Change and Impacts. And in that, they are unequivocal. They believe we're going to pass 1.5 in 2030, and we're going to pass 2 degrees in 2040. And they have laid out what those consequences are: increased migration, reduced food and water, instability. So, the United States military, which, by the way, emits more carbon than 140 countries combined. So let's just take that in for a second. Has every intention of following through on their plan. And we need to take them seriously as well. If they're taking this seriously, you need to take this seriously. Okay, so your strategic plan needs an overhaul. Rupert is absolutely correct. Your lobbyists need to immediately engage in intense efforts to support climate mitigation and fossil fuel drawdown. And that is going to make some of you seize up, because I know it. I can feel it already. I can feel that intake of breath going, we're here to lobby for our members and what they want. Yeah, well, what they want is the status quo, and what they're going to get is catastrophe. So you have an obligation to stand up and think, where do the things I lobby for impact human life, animal life, species? What do I do? What are we doing? Your lobbyists should be standing up for your members and their lives and livelihoods. We're no longer livelihood only. We are lives and livelihood. So you've got to get your regulatory and your lobbyists and your efforts dedicated towards the one thing that you need to get. Your PACs, all of it. And this is not political. I'm really tired of this climate change is a Democratic issue. It is not a Republican issue. That's not true. This is beyond polarization. This is beyond politics. This is beyond your narrow view of who you are and who you talk to. This is everyone in the same boat.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a typically conservative legislative department, there is nothing more conservative than conserving nature and conserving resources and conserving economies and conserving life. Okay? You can do this whether you are a right-leaning organization or a left-leaning organization. I don't care. You need to be representing everyone in your industry and profession and get beyond politics. You need to do an open-eyed analysis on your members' industries and professions. What does your members' business do that either creates a more regenerative world or creates more carbon emissions, and how they're doing business? And you need to develop consulting programs that help them make the transition. Give them hints, give them ideas, help them retool their businesses so that they're more climate savvy. And this, this is because of disruption, right? Like, I work for an entirely virtual organization, and during the rolling power blackouts we had in 2019 over the forest fires, I was offline for sometimes 4 and 5 days in a row. So I had solar chargers that would charge my phone so that I could do Zoom calls in the yard.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing. Business continuity. Abandon sustainability. Sustainability is not going to get you where you need to go. Start learning about regeneration. It's a completely different concept. You cannot sustain an unsustainable practice. We live in a finite planet with finite resources and finite water and finite coal and finite tin and copper, and we continue to expect we can have limitless growth. Limitless growth on a finite planet is a myth. It's a myth. It's impossible. Once the refrigerator's empty, it's empty. Once the planet is empty, it's empty. We should be conserving resources as much as possible. Encourage yourself and your members to join the Friday for Future. Climate strikes on Fridays. Have your restaurants, have your businesses. And I know you just came out of COVID and you want to get back to business and you're already struggling, and economically this is a problem. I'm telling you, this isn't going to get better.
Yeah. It's not going away.
It's going to get better. It's not going away.
Yeah.
Stop holding conferences in the way you've always done them. The future is hyper-local. You need to reinvest in your chapters and capacity build on the ground. And this goes against everything that I believe, because I have been kind of anti-chapter for most of my consulting career, because we all know they're a pain in the neck. And I'm telling you right now, I was wrong. I'm going to admit it. I was wrong. Reinvest in your chapters and local leadership on the ground, because the future is hyper-local. Hyper-local. Don't go back to business as usual inside your offices. Do you know that 4 average air conditioners add 5.6 tons of carbon emissions annually? That's 4 air conditioners. How many air conditioners do we have on the planet? Air conditioning alone is going to add 0.5 degrees Celsius to the 1.5.
Well, and then if you think about it, I'm sorry to interrupt. If you think about it, when we're looking at places like Seattle and Portland that are having these record high, like a lot of, like my cousin lives there and didn't ever have to worry about having an air conditioner. And then people are passing out in the heat because they have no way to get cool. What do you think that they're going to purchase? They're going to purchase more, like there's going to be more air conditioners. Right, in places that there never have been before. That's not helping us.
After COP26, the country of Australia, one of their climate mitigation is increased air conditioning deployment in Australia.
Yeah.
That's not the answer. There are lots of ways to do cooling, but air conditioning is crucial, right? And then we start getting into ideas about equity. Is it only the people who have air conditioners? And what about all the people who don't? And if you really want to stay awake, and I'm not going to go into this, but if you really want to stay awake, just Google wet bulb temperature. That is the temperature and humidity combination beyond which the human body cannot survive.
Yeah.
And we've approached wet bulb temperatures in Pakistan and a number of places around the globe in the last year or so. I'm not going to go into that now, but so radically reinvent your chapters. Stop holding conferences. Don't go back to the office. You don't have to go back to the office. Release that office space. Let your people stay home. as much as possible. Stop holding your conferences. Every flight you take is adding to the global carbon budget when we have no budget left. So conferences need to be broken out and regionalized so that you can get there by train or by some alternative transportation, not doing all the flying.
Do you feel that sharp intake of breath,
Oh yeah.
Shelly? Because
No. I'm just sitting here, just like I feel like I'm just throwing darts at a board, and everyone is like seizing up. Like our whole idea since 2020 was to go back to holding conferences because they're fun and we like them and we get to go places, and that's great. And every time you get on a plane, you're adding to the total. Every time you do that. So think carefully about, this is what I mean about being radical, about looking at your strategic plan and looking at the way you do things. COVID was a blessing in disguise because it actually showed you that you can adapt. You had to adapt in an emergency situation, correct? Wouldn't it have been a lot nicer if you'd already started that adaptation process before that happened? How many conferences are going to be held in top tier cities that are going to have to worry about cancellation because of hurricanes, because of weather events that are happening, right? Your sponsors and affiliates, it's real tempting to take the check from the company when it shows up at the door. But if you are committed to doing something about the situation, you're going to have to ask them some hard questions about what their carbon footprint is, about what they're doing on climate mitigation, and whether or not you are going to take their money if they are not contributing to the solution. That's voting with your economic dollar. That's voting with your ability to say, you need to improve. You need to improve. You want exposure to my members? Stop feeling like you need to take a handout, y'all. You want access to my members? This is what my members care about. Do you care about this? If fine, great, we can have a partnership. If not, don't. And last but not least, I'm going to say invest in mental health resources for your members. You should be developing relationships with the American Psychological Association and all manner of psychological services for your members to give them access to more and more and more. We're seeing it in our youth with highly, highly advanced social anxiety, depression, et cetera, et cetera. We're being traumatized by COVID. We're being traumatized by supplies. I go into my grocery store. There are empty shelves. There's been empty shelves since 2020. We're not used to that, right? We're not used to that. There are 2 jars of peanut butter. I'm going to take one and leave something for someone else. This isn't going to stop. We've all seen the boxes getting smaller. We all know agricultural production in the United States is going down and has been for a while. So mental health resources, this is not a game. Your leaders need mental health help. You do, your staff does, your members do. Let's start being more authentic. Let's start being more authentic about the things we're struggling with, and let's build support so we can talk about it, so we can talk about grief. There's grief over losing conferences. There's grief over making some of the choices I'm asking you to make. This is hard. This is hard work. You're going to have to allow yourselves to feel it, internalize it, work with it, and then dedicate yourselves to radical reinvention. The time is now. There is no other time. There is no other time. There really isn't.
This is the most important. I don't care what anybody else says to me about the production quality or questions asked or anything. Shelly, this is the most important discussion I think that the association community can hear right now, this year, and moving forward, because these are not problems that are going away. They are not problems that we're going to be dealing with issues that we've never dealt with before, or we've only had a taste of so far. And The one thing about humans that we know for sure is that over time, the way that we've been able to get this far is when we've been able to work together and do things together. That is the power. We're not the strongest. We don't have the strongest claws. We aren't, the biggest beast in the jungle, but we can come together and work together to make big things happen. That's also what associations do.
Yes.
So humans and associations, we are humans working in associations. This is the thing. This is our time to come together and make big things happen, because we have to.
We have to. And my message to ASAE and all of the state SAEs, you know me. You know me. You know what needs to be done. Let's do this. Somebody call me. Somebody email me. Somebody say, we want to have a conversation about this. We want to pull together as a community and finally rise to the potential that we know we have. We love to talk about it. We're not good at demonstrating it. That time is over.
Yeah.
And if I had to just, say one, sort of last thing as we close, I want to reach back to activist Mario Savio, who's famous for the speech that he gave UC Berkeley, I believe. And this is what he said. Now, I'm just being honest with you. I'm being straight with you. At the risk of my professional reputation, at the risk of all of it, I don't care. This is important. But this is what Mario said. There is a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart, that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears, upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it and the people who own it that unless you are free, the machine will be prevented from working. Get to work. Strike. Do what you have to do. This is our time. I'm begging you to open your eyes, even if it hurts. I'm begging you to let it hurt. And then I'm asking you to take action for yourselves, for your children. So thank you, Kiki, for having us on today. I very much appreciate the opportunity to have been here. And you're awesome, and you rock, and you provided us with a platform today that we hope makes a difference.
I love you, Shelly. I love the work that you do. Thank you. Thank you for doing what you do. Okay, so that is my birthday present to myself and hopefully to the association community that I love. And I hope you listen to it. Like I said before, I think it's probably the most important association chat episode that I'll ever do. So with that, I hope you keep asking questions to learn every day, because as Joseph Campbell once said, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. Oh, I usually say, have a great rest of the week, everyone. Right now, I'm going to ask you to do something to make a difference, and really don't let this episode fade away. Share it, follow Shelly's tips. And if you really, really, really want to do something, reach out. And I guarantee you, if you reach out to Shelly, if you reach out to me, I'll connect you with Shelly and we'll figure out how to do something together. Okay. Now, have a great rest of the week, everyone.